that splash against my hollow bones, that rocks my soul. Looking back over my false dreams that I once knew, wondering why my dreams never came true. Is it because I'm black? Somebody tell me, what can I do? Oh, Lord. Oh, something is holding me back. Is it because I'm black? Yeah. In this world of no pity, I was raised in the ghettos of the city. Yeah. Oh, Lord. Mama, she worked so hard to earn every penny. Yeah. Oh, 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 oh.
You fellas better quit jiving. You better get yourself together and get blacker now, because that's the real thing that's happening now. So-called brothers telling lies. You colored people are just signifying. You better go to a natural school. Negroes get hot, black people get in the pool. I don't know whether you realize before you get your respect, you got to be black or not. It took me a long time to cut my hair. The reason why I wasn't aware, I didn't understand what it meant to be a man, but that's the only way in this man's land. I don't think you realize before you get your respect, you got to be black and white. Been leaning on others to be your keeper. That's why they call you Negroes and colored people. Better change your strut and get in a swing. Find yourself and do your own thing. I don't know whether you realize before you get recognized, you got to be black and white. Get it? I don't know whether you realize before you get recognized, brother, you got to be black and white. Now you don't have to be like an Oreo cookie, brother. Black on the outside and white on the inside.
Yes, my skin is black, but that's no reason to hold me back.
Why don't you think about it, 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 think about it. I have wants and desires just like you, so move on aside because I'm coming through. Oh, 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 oh. No matter how hard you try, you can stop me now. No matter how hard you try.
Hi everybody, can you hear me? Yes, yes, no, maybe so.
No matter how hard you try, you can stop me now.
Oh, thank you. Hi everybody, and I should say, because of the timeline and I know classes and such, I would invite people who are up here to come down this way. So if you're back there, can you come up here? Shout out to Aman and Professor Haley. Can you move? Shout out to Professor Avila. Can you come this way? Shout out to the people in the back there. You mind coming up forward just a little bit? I swear there's no call and response that's going to happen. Yes, that's great. That is great. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. For those who do not know, I'm Professor Marcus Anthony Hunter, Associate Professor in Sociology and also Chair in the Department of African American Studies. And it gives me great pleasure to be here to have an event for our own Gaye Theresa Johnson, and also Alex Lubin and their wonderful and masterful edited collection, The Futures of Black Radicalism. I also think it is purely the universe and also accidental that it happened to be on Election Day. You know, what better time to think about blackness, future, and radicalism separately and together in a time like the one in which we live. Before we get started, we have been very fortunate to have our dean, Darnell Hunt, who is professor of sociology and African American studies and former director of the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies and Research. Here, he is our faculty member and also our dean, so it's a double bubble. He's gonna bring us with some great introductory remarks and I will follow him. Please give a round of applause to Dean Hunt.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Wow, Election Day, here we go again, right? It should be very interesting and telling, I think, a little bit later today when we figure out what happens in terms of these returns. Well, you know, on behalf of the division, the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Chicano and Chicana Studies, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this launch event for our colleague, Gaye Theresa Johnson, and her co-editor for this new exciting edited volume, Futures of Black Radicalism. Engaged, socially relevant research is the foundation of the Division of Social Sciences here at UCLA. It's something that I really want to emphasize in my tenure as dean. We are proud of the departments of African American Studies and Chicana Studies for their long-standing and seminal contributions in this regard. Linking both departments, Professor Johnson perfectly embodies this tradition, her work probing new ways of thinking about how to approach long-standing problems of activism and social movements. I'm so pleased to be here today to celebrate her latest scholarly achievement with you and to be in dialogue with you about its many implications in a time that's calling out for answers. Thank you.
So not to wait any longer, we're gonna start off. This will happen in 2 courses, and then we have a 3rd course, which is an actual meal. So the first 2 things to whet your intellectual appetite, the last one to actually feed you. So the first one we wanted to start off with is some responses from graduate students or recent graduate students, because it is my understanding that Jonathan Gomez is now Dr. Gomez, shout out to him, sociology. And so I want to bring up Jonathan Gomez, Olufemi Taiwo, Tabisile Griffin, and Marquise Vestal, who are going to provide some responses to the book from Emergent scholar perspective. And then we'll hear from some established scholars and contributors after that. So I'll invite you all to go ahead as you please, and I will be keeping time. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out. Thank you, Gaye, for inviting us. It's, you know, it's an honor to be here, especially, you know, me, Mark, and Jonathan caught Cedric's last course that he taught at UCSB, and it was, you know, we would make that trek for the time is starting. I'll tell that story later. But in the spirit of preserving the collective being, we kind of reorganized our panel discussions in sort of a collective discussion, so it'll be about 20 minutes of all of us just giving y'all what we have. So we can start with you.
Oh, you want me to start?
Yeah.
About that, I guess we could tell part of that story. So we did take Cedric's last lecture, and after I read this book, I didn't realize, or I realized it now, Cedric's the most dangerous man I've ever met. And the reason why is when we'd be sitting in lecture hall, there was this huge window on the left, and he'd be telling his stories the way that he tells his stories. He'd start like in ancient Greece or something, and I'd be like, what are you doing? And then he'd bring it all around. And but reading The Futures of Black Radicalism, I realized that something that I hadn't realized now is the reason why this book is so dangerous, and the reason why Cedric's work is so dangerous is because it calls us one of the best things about blackness is its ability to assemble people that aren't supposed to be together under racial capitalism. And so what I'd like to start off with is talking about assembly, dangerous assembly. What does it mean for us to organize and to do scholarship that's revealing these histories of struggle under racial capitalism with people that aren't supposed to be together? So how dangerous would it be if we were to be producing histories and doing work and organizing and trying to produce knowledge that put Trump supporters in here against capitalism? It's far more dangerous than pretty much everybody in the room right now that probably already ideologically aligned. So to me, that's one of the most dangerous things about Black radicalism is that drive towards assembly.
Yes, I'd like to just echo my thanks for inviting me to be here, and just to be sitting here with this, panel of great folks, and what you're bringing up about assembly. When we talk about Professor Robinson's work, the Black radical tradition more generally, the folks that I've studied with, we always are drawn to the palenque, right? The maroon, the maroonage. And even when I taught this last year, I taught Black movements in America, and my undergraduate students were so drawn to what you just brought up right now about how people who we've been told were so different, in fact, worked across their differences in order to find the similarities to struggle for freedom, right? And that was in the backwoods, that was in, off the main roads, right? And I think that right now in our time and what we face in the world, my students at UCSB are looking around, and they're really struggling to think about, how they come together to achieve broad forms of social justice. And this work, I think, provides us with a roadmap of achieving many different kinds of, points of social justice on the road to, continuing to struggle. And so, I'd like to return to that, but just this idea, I'm just paying attention to the fact that right now, this moment, so many students are paying attention to just that, right? Whether it's across race, whether it's across sexuality, class, and yeah, so Professor Robinson's work has always been that kind of push to go in that direction in an environment that often steers you away from that, so.
A quote that I always share that I remember, I think it was week 6 of his class that he said, was there's no point in us being in the academy if we're not gonna blow it up.
Yeah.
And so it's very instructive, right? And so, we talked a little bit about this before this panel on what would be most useful for us to present on. And we were thinking about very tangible ways to disrupt the academy in the positions that we are in now. And so, Femi, you want to go into that?
Sure. So, in general, how I think this university racket goes is they get a bunch of us in here, they give us some training, and they haze us through, this process to become an academic. But at the end of it, you're just here with all these resources, with all these labs, with all these books, with all these people that can make shit happen, with all this money. And they ask you what you want to do with it. They ask you what your dissertation's going to be. They ask you what research project you want to start, what grant you want to apply for. And you end up with, however, thousands of knowledge projects that connect sometimes with things that matter, and other times with things that matter to us, the people who are left in the room after whoever has survived the hazing and harassment and whatever else it takes to stay here has been selected through this Hunger Games type shit. And once you're there, you have a decision to make on your own, it seems like. And that decision's about what interests you. And I just think that that whole system is fucked up. It's weird that it really comes down to me and what I happen to be interested in, what I end up using all the stuff that's around here to build. I don't think we don't matter in terms of deciding like what the research programs are gonna be. But I think there's a structural problem when there's a balance between that and us mattering so much that just comes down to us and our professional interests and what part of the literature we're trying to disrupt. When there's real, when there's real things on the table that folks need to know. And my example for this is always Flint, because it's just obvious, right? The thing to me, there's a lot of things that are fucked up about Flint, but one of the most fucked up things is that the labs that broke the story open weren't even in that area, weren't even in Michigan. The labs that broke the story open were in Virginia. It just happened to be that some person with a lab was interested in doing that part of the organizing work that residents of the community of Flint had already started. And to me, that's a massive failure of all the public universities in that area. It's a massive failure. And so, yeah, so I think one of the things we all talked about before this and we all agree upon is that's something we need to start to shift as researchers structurally, but in the meantime, there's stuff that we can just do, and that looks like actionable research. It looks like research that lets the community not just decide how they feel about it, but also what the research questions are in the first place. And that the research that may need to be done may not be about who at Wesleyan says the thing you think is false. It might be something else entirely.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point because when I've been at UCLA for a long time. I did 2 years as an undergraduate here. I did 2 years as a graduate student in my master's degree, and now I've done 3 years in my PhD. And I'm from LA. And when I came here, there wasn't any easy or discernible way for me to go into a department and be like, I need connections to the community. Tell me one activist organization or somebody that's doing work on this particular thing that I can get access to through this university, even though this has the name of this city. So that's something that's very important. And then when we start doing research, it's a very simple thing. Nobody ever said just go to the street and ask what's wrong. It's go to the literature. But then how do we institutionalize a practice where both those things are happening at the same time? Because then when we started to work with community folks, like in the Community Scholars Program, we had folks that would just ask simple questions that I would have never asked if I just stayed in literature. And so it was something super simple. After Watts, when people burned damn near half this city down because they are pissed off about the cops and they couldn't get to work, somebody that does work for Trust South LA asked me, what did black folks do for transportation after Watts? It's a super simple question, and that the historian on Black Los Angeles should have known. And then I even was like, oh yeah, let me go, somebody's wrote some shit on this before. And then I go in there and nobody's written shit on it. And I would have never asked. Something else that's very simple that Cedric taught me was follow the money. That things about discourse, culture, race, meaning, and money are all the same thing. And so then, like, I do stuff on housing. And so it was something super simple. I was like, I wonder what percentage of African Americans have been tenants since emancipation. And it's always been a majority. But we don't got shit written on black tenants, barely anything. Even though when we think about the span of the Great Migration, I mean, this is arguable, but the biggest political, economic, of the highest value are tenants paying rent to white landlords. Because with the urbanization of African Americans, they were tenants on a plantation and then became tenants in the city. And we don't really have like a grounded political economic analysis of paying rent or tenants or taking land or taking apartment buildings or, seizing the means, which but these are just the very grounded political economic questions that work like the Futures of Black Radicalism and Cedric's work. This is the type of stuff that we would like to institutionalize in a very real way.
Yeah, when we talk about like actual tangible things we can do, an example of something that's easy to do is use university funds to have consistent work-study circles between scholars both in and out of academia. But I'm talking about like for transportation, I'm talking about like for food, for materials, for books, for articles, you know, have everything paid for and have that like set, like a norm of all universities to be able to do that, to be able to come up with those questions.
And I've shared this with folks before, but it's similarly to y'all about, you know, reaching out to the community. When I began my doctoral program at UC Santa Barbara, I showed up to Professor Robinson's office hours, and I was really upset at the things that weren't there that I thought should be there, right? The kinds of community-based relationships that you're talking about, the kinds of opportunities to listen and learn from people on the ground doing the work that I was interested in learning about, right? And you know, and he's just sitting back listening to me, you know, and he asked me a question that has continued to be fruitful, you know, many years later, right? And it was, well, first it came with a critique, right? And he said, well, you're searching for love in a place that doesn't love you, you know? And he's talking about the university, you know? And then he said, followed up with the question, you know, well, what are the spaces that you're going to create that are capable of doing that, right? And, you know, following that, it's been both, you know, creating, you know, concrete spaces with people in the community, right? I've been able to work with people, you know, in a range of different spaces, but then it's also the discursive spaces, right? The kinds of critical questions that we can then, you know, ask one another, ask each other, be asked by others, right? And engage in those kinds of, you know, collaborations, you know what I mean? And so it was always, you know, much more than simply being, you know, and y'all that have read the book know this, right? You know, the Black radical tradition is not about simply the university, but you know, about freedom more broadly than that, right? About, you know, people like you're talking about, the tenants and things like that. And so, yeah, you know, I think, yeah, the spaces. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
So, one more thing. I think to do this in a sustainable, structural kind of way, we have to set up relationships of accountability between ourselves as academics, with other academics, with people who aren't here. Yeah, and there's no other way that's going to work. So one tangible example of what that might look like are times in history where that was kind of forced on folks. You couldn't be African Marxist intellectual in the 60s and 70s and not have to have concrete things to say about how we're going to win this anti-colonial movement. How we're gonna do the project of building whatever's gonna replace colonial government. That was the question that folks had to answer. If you read the old Ufahamu African Studies journals from starting back in the 70s, it's very concrete to the point. Here are the corporations in Namibia that are running the mines. Here's how we're getting these folks out. It's, you know, plain, and you can see why someone asked this question. Because they were accountable. Because if they weren't responsive to what was going on, they wouldn't be relevant. So one idea of what that might look like in our time are looking at things like what the requirements are for tenure. Right now, it's just there's, you know, a dozen or so other academics in your department, and they decide if they like you or not, or whether you've jumped through the hoops. But what if community organizations were part of the tenure process? What if 2 or 3 of your recommendation letters had to come with people you worked with, or that your research affected, or that your research was relevant to? I think people's approach would change in a hurry.
Well, I was just thinking about another Cedric quote pops into my head. And he taught the class with Esther Lesra, so it was like double amazing. But he would always say that culture masks the economy. And because it masks the economy, it reveals the economy. Because to mask something is to it's to realize it. You know, it's to realize the economy, right? So in essence, I'm thinking about accountability and the way we get distracted by culture a lot of the time, and we don't keep our mindset on what the economic circumstances, what the material circumstances are for that project. But I was just thinking that through.
Yeah, I think we're out of time, but the finding ways to, I'm not sure.
We got 4 minutes.
Okay. Finding ways to institutionalize these practices, right? So major questions that have been going on right now are like questions about work. Like people are broke and unemployed. Like, and if there are community folks that have questions about how does this particular law work, or what's going on with Black workers and the unemployment crisis, how is mass incarceration affecting folks getting jobs? How are these infrastructure projects that are funneling in billions of dollars in infrastructure, but barely no Black folks, like up and down Crenshaw, you can go and look at all those construction projects and there aren't any Black folks on those projects. Like, how do we understand these political economic relationships, and why isn't this university, a public university, doing that public service of figuring that shit out? Because we haven't institutionalized the practices, because there aren't incentive structures here to get that shit done, because if you do it, you get punished. You know, so if you, like right now, the way that shit is set up is if you do community work, it's always like this pull, like you're getting pulled in the other direction. Shouldn't be like that. Mm-hmm. This is a public university, and this city is full of festering problems and oppression. And that's where our research questions should be coming from. And there should be some institutionalization that's very clear, that's not just coming from us and whether I feel like doing the work or not, but should be like, there should be an institutionalized practice where a community organization can come to UCLA and say, hey, we need this work done. And there should be some money and some resources thrown behind it. And then the work gets done. And then you throw the authority and the resources of this university and all of its money. I mean, you know, you have the classes that we're teaching, a class of 800 students. I mean, imagine how much money's in that classroom, all that tuition. And so we're sitting in the classroom with literally millions of dollars of capital. To do what? You see what I'm saying? Like, if I'm gonna fill a classroom with $1 million of capital, that's some dangerous shit. There's a lot of money here. You see what I'm saying?
But, I mean, it's a deep point that you make about how you get punished for it. And I think it's why we can't, you know, one of the things about our time that we have to consider as far as what the future looks like is just the academic job market. You know, one of the ways that capitalism polices this research out of relevance is just the fact that everybody's so fucking precarious. Yep. It's hard to get a job at all, much less if you don't do the specific things that departments want you to do, and avoid the specific things they want you to not do. And so all the policing tactics of what the literature looks like and what's hot in your field get amped up when, you know, adjunct labor is super economically precarious, when they're not opening tenure lines. Like, this is a broad, you know, we have to do the same political economy that we're talking about for the rest of the world to our own situation.
No, wonderful. No, and the ideas that are coming to mind, and you know, I had the great privilege of having, you know, Professor Robinson as a mentor who I could, you know, go into their office hours. The great privilege of having, you know, Elizabeth Robinson as my teacher, you know, of having many scholars of the Black radical and practitioners of the Black radical tradition as my mentors. And one thing is that I've gotten this from different people is, you know, the mentorship and the encouragement to recognize the broader political project outside of earning a degree. Unfortunately, you know, it's like, you know, we would like to have, you know, these gigs as educators, but as, you know, you talk about precarity, right? We you know, I'm on the job market right now, right? So it's like, and you see these gigs going and stuff like that, right? And you're like, but I thought I was the perfect one for that, right? And one thing that is reminding me, right, is I hear, right, the encouragement to, what is the political project, right? And how are you going to carry forward that political project if it's not here in the university, right? And another thing that, Cedric taught myself and a few others, right, really carefully is that, he always remind us to have a modest audacity, you know what I mean? In the sense that, we, given our times, right, in this kind of neoliberal era where there's a lot of encouragement to be these hyper cutthroat competitive folks, how are you able to be, respectful? How are you able to be collaborative rather than competitive, right? How are you able to, listen and be willing to learn from people that, all throughout your educational training, you're told those are the people you're supposed to teach. You know what I mean? How are you able to create relationships that are genuine and honest, where you're able to you go in knowing that you have something to learn, And so I want to be involved in this ongoing conversation with y'all, because it sounds like this is something that's going on here that is, you're asking questions that I hear graduate students at UCSB asking, undergraduates asking, and I'm sure it goes on beyond UCLA and UCSB, you know what I mean? So thank you for allowing me to be up here and to, riff off of what y'all are organizing here, Thank you.
Thank you, John.
This is, fortunately, I'm just loud. So before we move into some comments from the co-editors, I just wanted to come back to what is on the screen. I love the cover. You should go get one. I'm going to read something from the back of the book from Harry Belafonte, and then I want to pose something to the panelists. And then after a brief response, I'm going to invite the co-editors up for some comments, and then we can have some Q&A, and we'll transition to course number 2. All right, so in America, issues of race, poverty, and injustice haunt our nation. Futures of Black Radicalism examines causes and resolutions of these troubling challenges. The need for radical thinking has never been more evident. To this end, this book is not just a gift, it is a necessity. So why I bring that up is, one, shout out to Harry Belafonte. I mean, that's amazing. And I think he's also right, like he always is. And part of what this brings up for me is this idea of the future. So in my own work, I often use outer space as a way of thinking about this question I'm going to ask. And that is, one, history of America in many ways, or of the world, is about eliminating black people little by little, here and there, wherever they might be. And by black, I mean black in the Gwendolyn Brooks sense of the word, where black is a preoccupation. It brings people in here, there, or wherever they might be. So it's not just about skin color or consciousness, but about power. And so I often think to myself, oh yeah, that means that like black women are from the future, because there's never any space for them, and they're always right about what's happening, and we never listen. And then black boys are from outer space, because there's no space for you. There's no space for black women's reproductive rights and such. So where are they pulling them? It has to be from the far galaxies of such. And one thing I often think is in outer space, what is interesting is that the world is black, and what is white is dead. But for whatever reason, in the inverse, where we live, we do the opposite, where whiteness is life and blackness is death. And so I ask everyone here on the panel before we bring up the speakers, what is the future of black radicalism, particularly in a moment where it is difficult to be black and also be radical?
I have something quick. Yes. Well, concerning kind of the binary that you bring up, yes, in terms of space and stuff, yeah, like that, Black Marxism was about the constant reproducing of whiteness and blackness in accordance to the changing context, right? So to begin, we need to ask ourselves what the context is today and what blackness and whiteness means in a different time, space, and context, right? Those are the three things. What was the second portion of your question?
So what is the future of, so part of what is great about each of you is that you all were also recipients of Professor Robinson's pedagogy. right? And so one thing that I think many of us who are professors who are in the room often think is the struggle of, well, I'm trying to do this thing, but everything about it tells me I'm gonna be irrelevant to the world. Mm-hmm. So part of what you do is often you work with students to create some sort of future of sorts. So you all here represent, Cedric Robinson's future. And so my question is really about what does that future look like from your perspective, being Black and being radical in a moment where, one, those two things don't always go together, and then two, in a context where politically, is it even viable to stay alive and call yourself a Black radical?
Okay. Mine is being absurd, because, and Erica Edwards talked about this in one of the last chapters of Futures of Black Radicalism. She said that one of Cedric's important implications or important tendencies in his work was this managed optimism that he pushed for. And Robin talked about Cedric's optimism and faith and hope brought in through the church and stuff like that, right? So my thinking is that the universities or the state, their cause of absurdity for our demands should be our managed optimism, right? And so we should make that equivalent, that we need to try at all times to do absurd shit. Pardon me, elders.
No, it's okay. Hashtag shit. That's one of the things. I should also say we're on Twitter, so feel free. Black Radicals, Black Futures is a hashtag, and also there is a link that you can tweet as well. So feel free to be using the Twitter as well as my grandmother calls it. Other comments, yeah.
One of the things that Fred Moten's always pissing me off, but I love him as a person because every time he talks, like, the thing about being in academia is you get into a room and everybody's saying something you already agree with, and Moten always says something I disagree with at the time and then learn later on. And so when we invited him to the Undercommons, which is our freedom school at UCLA that we named after a book that he co-authored, he was messing with, I think Femi was on stage, and Femi has this thing about the fact that he hates Kant, and so Moten was like, oh, I find blackness everywhere. I find blackness in Kant. And everybody was like flipping out. And then he was saying that he had a view of blackness that pretty much everybody there disagreed with, because for Moten, blackness wasn't about bodies and whiteness wasn't about bodies. It was about a way that you practice communion or relationships, or the way that you are in the world. And so there was a white man who was there who was like antagonistic towards Moten, and he started like flipping out. And Moten told him that he hated white boys. And everybody was like, whoa, you can't say that. And he was like, well, let me tell you what I mean. But it was about that. It was about the fact that he was acting as a white person in that space. And then the next thing that Moten said was, to folks that were there, whether they identified as Black or not, and this is where I see the future of Black radicalism, is Moten said that blackness has already made a claim to you. How are you going to make a claim to it? And that's the power of Black radicalism, constantly making claims to everyone. It says we started this. We're in the forest. We started this community. This is our marinage. We start a fire. Follow the smoke. Follow these stars. Follow the running water till you reach this cove. Blackness is always making claims to people. And these are the narratives, and this is the work that we do as scholars. We have to constantly start producing narratives and histories where the Black radical tradition is making claims to people that racial capitalism would see as our opponents. So if we're just producing narratives that already collectivize stuff that when you do it and nobody's coming down on your head, then it's not what we need. But if you start talking shit about debt, global debt, and you start getting people together on that, so then you take people that are in the city and you go to Ferguson in the rural areas, because that's what racial capitalism has done, is it split us up spatially, racially, by class, and you start getting together and be like, how much rent you paying to the landlord? I know my rent's too high. What about your rent? How much money you paying to the student loan servicing? How much money you paying to the city when they gave you that quality of life citation or that parking ticket? And then you start getting people together on that. But if we produce work as an historian that shows examples of that work, then you're dangerous. And that's the future of Black That's the way that I see it. It's producing these narratives that put people together that aren't supposed to be together. And that shit's dangerous, and that's when they'll come for you.
Yeah, what he said. Yes, any other thoughts?
Please. You know, I liked what you talked to, your comments about space and outer space. And I've always, for a while now, I've always said that Sade had it right when she talked about people moving through space with minimum waste, right? And that's how I refer to, you know, that's the conditions that our young kids in the city of LA are experiencing right now. I was able to engage with young kids who refer to their walks in their barrio of East LA as missions, right? Missions, right? No strolls, right? They take missions because the stakes are so tremendous, right? The pocket checks are so, just repetitive and just just so violent, you know. And so for me, when I heard Sade after studying, I was like, damn, she got it right. You know what I mean? She knew that, right? In different contexts. But for me, I feel like the future of Black radicalism is at the hop, right? And right now, in different parts of South Central LA, you have members of various Black and brown car club organizations seizing space to create these really empowering, really exciting gatherings, right? And they seize Walmart shopping centers, right, for their own use, right? They gather at abandoned rail yards, right, to get together because in their communities they've been banned from Crenshaw, they've been banned from Whittier Boulevard, right? And so for me, looking at how people turn these desolate spaces into these lively social destinations, and when they're there, they use imagination, improvisation, and concrete action to start talking about things that they've been told to shut up about, right? We don't want to hear about housing. Well, they're going to talk about it there, right? You can't speak about policing. Well, they're going to talk about it there, right? And their right to be mobile in the city in many different ways, right? So for me, I go there, you know.
Thank you, Doctor. Vinny, you have any thoughts?
I liked what you said about outer space, where outer space, blackness is the world. And, I don't really care what whiteness is, but I think that to me is the future of Black radicalism. Black radicalism needs to, hopefully will, reclaim the world. And what I mean by that is I feel like I read stuff now and blackness is seems to me like a sandbox. Like there are Black issues and then there are just other issues. So people don't want to talk about, or people aren't yet talking about debt and trade policy the way, my example is always the anti-colonial fighters, the intellectuals of that era, the way that they were, because if you were contesting that, if you were contesting everything about the world that was messed up, you were making a claim to the entirety of the world. There's not just a box of your issues and then the rest of human thought. No one ever asks me why Kant is relevant to something. That's part of why he's the devil, right? But people will ask me that about Cabral or Du Bois, and I don't see it. Cabral said something that's true. It's true for everyone. Like he has the same claim to that, or Cabral is making the same claim of each of us that any person can make of each of us. And when we reclaim that, I think we are taking a step to reclaiming the world.
Thank you so much for those wonderful answers, and it is my great pleasure to introduce the co-editors of the volume. First, We have Gaye Theresa Johnson, who is also author of Sounds of Solidarity, Spaces of Conflict on University of California Press. She also is the vice chair at the Department of African American Studies and also the chair of the Faculty Advisory Committee for the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies and Research, also known as paying her dues and putting her money where her mouth is, okay? So she doesn't just write books about Black people, she supports Black institution building. So the next person I have the great pleasure of introducing, and I met today, is Professor Alex Lubin. And I should say, I'm gonna read everybody's bio from the book, in part because if it was good enough for the book, it's good enough for here, and also as a sign of continuing to show it so you can see said book as well. But Professor Alex Lubin is chair of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. He is author of Geographies of Liberation, a Making of an Afro-Arab Political Imaginary, and co-editor of American Studies Encounters in the Middle East. It is my great pleasure to invite them to make responses, and then we'll have a Q&A.
I would start over here, and I don't know if you want to also come up here later or whatever, but I'll sit down once we begin. But first I want to say thank you to everyone who's here, all the people who've come to support us, and both personally and professionally. And we're also, because we are here to talk about something that's very important in the title, The Futures of Black Radicalism, but also around the past, around the Black radical tradition and traditions of resistance that have made it possible for us to be here and to speak about these things, but also have made it possible for us to be alive and to thrive and to do more than just survive. And so we really want to thank folks for coming, but we also really want to thank all of the folks who have responded. And I want to explain why these students and Dr. Gomez now recently, but also why this way? Why engage the book in this way? Part of the reason is because when we first began to talk about this as a project, Cedric Robinson with Elizabeth Robinson was very clear that he did not want a tribute to his work. He wanted to see how his scholarship worked in other people's work. And he had a list of people that he admired very much. And so in many respects, this, as we write in the acknowledgments, this book is the fulfillment of that wish. And we were very honored to ask those folks to participate. So a tribute he did not want. And this is why the charge for us was to engage with the range of his scholarship and not just Black Marxism, but also the work that he did in film and so many other places that made generative contributions to the field of Black studies, but so many other fields too, as we now know them. So what I wanted to do actually was to start with really kind of the sentiment of why we have this book here now, and then to thank you, and then to talk a little bit about. Alex will talk about how it is, what it is that we are trying to accomplish in this book. So let me just read a bit from the acknowledgments, actually. So I start with what I've just said about this book being the fulfillment of a wish. As the idea for this edited volume came to fruition, it was Cedric Robinson himself, with Elizabeth Robinson's insights, who devised the list of scholars whose offerings would eventually grace these pages in critical engagement with the Black radical tradition. Cedric, himself a voracious and meticulous reader, saw something in these scholars' work that he wished to draw out in conversation with his own. He looked forward to reading these essays, and as his eyesight failed, the authors agreed to read them aloud in what would culminate in an audiobook meant for his own enjoyment. This is articulated here so that the reader may note that while every scholar invited to do so wrote as a student or a colleague, obligingly answering a teacher's instruction, there is also love and gratitude in the writing. And we, the editors, feel abundantly fortunate to have been called to this endeavor. And so our greatest thanks go to Cedric Robinson and Elizabeth Peters Robinson, Cedric's scholarship serves as a home for many of us who have committed ourselves to the invocation and incitement of the Black radical tradition, and we intended for him to enjoy and respond to these essays. And though we lost him before the book was finished, every page of the volume bears his imprint. And it was Elizabeth in the end who completed their contribution, who read our introduction and encouraged us heartily. I'd like to recognize her here in the audience. Thank you so much. And for her efforts, we are truly and deeply grateful. But we also wanted to make it clear that our scholarship means nothing without the people who work in mostly unacknowledged ways to get us all free. And while it's Cedric's engagement with the Black radical tradition that inspires the work that's presented here, we presumed to argue on behalf of the authors that it is equally the brilliant inventiveness practiced by radical social actors, by freedom seekers and freedom dreamers across the diaspora that serves as the incitement. And we ended our acknowledgements with these 4 phrases: freedom, unqualified liberation, abolition, nothing less. We'll now move to Alex's comments.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. And I think on the next panel, we'll talk more about the book specifically. So I want to use this opportunity first to thank you all for coming. And especially to thank my friend and co-editor and colleague, Gaye Theresa Johnson. Gaye and I met our first day in graduate school, and we've been close friends ever since, and it was a pleasure to work on this project with her. I wanted to highlight a few things that, that the panelists mentioned, and I want to thank you all for your presentations. I am actually no longer the chair of my department. I've been liberated from that responsibility, but only to take a more heinous one, which is that I'm now, for this year at least, the associate provost at my university. And I took that job specifically because I recognized, I've been made to recognize over years that the university is not a space for the kind of scholars or the kind of scholarship that I'm interested in. That the university is a place that recognizes and counts certain kind of labor and makes other kind of labor invisible. In particular, the kind of labor that gets invisible is work that's most frequently accountable to the communities that we go into academia to serve. So I've been meeting with several faculty, particularly women of color, who tell me that when they put up their promotion materials, they only list half of the work they do because that's all their Department of Political Science, sorry, this is live, but, or sociology, or history, or American studies. It's the only stuff that they recognize. It's the only stuff that matters. And so the question then becomes, how do you recognize the work so that the people who are already doing the work have a space within the academy? And that's a challenge. It's more of a challenge, I think, at a place like UCLA than it is at the University of New Mexico, where our doors are open to anybody that wants to come study. There's, we do have admission criteria, but they're so accessible, is the right word, that anybody can come study with us. And that means that we are, the bridge between the academy and the community just doesn't exist at a sort of working class public university in the ways that it might at this elite institution, even though it's a public elite institution. The other thing I wanted to mention, which ties in more directly to the book and how this book came about, is that one thing that Gaye and I are and have been very clear about is that although our names are on the cover of the book as the editors, this is really a book that's not even about the people who wrote the chapters within it, but it's about the people and the communities that were accountable as scholars, the people that we wanted to elevate in our scholarship. And in that sense, this is a work that is highly collaborative, that is accountable to communities that we want to give voice to. And in that sense, while the chapters in and of themselves are brilliant, as are the scholars who wrote them, what we intend for this is something that I think Cedric Robinson intended for his work too, which was to elevate the social movements, the radical traditions that animated the intellectuals that we know. That's why Black Marxism, you know, while some, I think, read it as an intellectual history of C.L.R. James or W.E.B. Du Bois or Richard Wright, I think they miss an opportunity if they do that to see that what Robinson was actually writing about were the communities of shared struggle in which these intellectuals wrote about. That it was the communities of struggle, the communities of fate, that animated the works of these scholars, and not these scholars themselves. So, you know, I hear the sense, on the one hand, from these brilliant panelists, that the university is not a home, as Dr. Gomez said. You know, paraphrasing Cedric Robinson, the university does not love you, so don't expect it, or something to that effect. And I think that's largely and sadly the case. The question then relates back to how do we create space, and in what spaces do we work? And that's a struggle that you guys will find solutions to. So I want to pause there because we'll talk more about the book at the next panel, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. And so Gaye stole my thunder. I'm just going to say that. But I wanted to ask Elizabeth Robinson to please stand. Please stand. Thank you, to be recognized. She came all the way here just for this. And I also say this, having been in a relationship for nearly 15 years, that it is not a one-person situation. So you might hear the name of one person, but you talking about everything with that person, you running every idea past them, you're complaining about every person to this person, and they go back with you and smile in front of those people, give you good ideas, remind you of who you are, keep your center of gravity. So it is important that we remember that, and I appreciate you so much for coming today. And we will hear more from Elizabeth later in the program. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to the folks in the audience to see if there are any questions, particularly about what we heard from the graduate students and also what was shared from the authors. Yes. Why don't you stand up and tell us who you are, where you be, where you from? Yes.
Double major, so Shana.
Shout out.
The question I have is like, what kind of like self-care do you guys engage in with like doing this work? Because it is like emotionally like laboring.
I mean, they got 6 generations. Well, I'm able to track my ancestry back here 6 generations to 2 counties, Maury County, Tennessee, and Navarro County, Texas. And 2 very different places, but one thing that binds it together, at least for you as black folks, is church. I'm not a religious person, and I'm not even very spiritual, but if I need to heal, I just listen to Aretha, the early stuff, gospel.
I say this without trying to sound crazy, but organizing is my self-care. Organizing, and I'm fortunate to be training in history right now. And so I think Jimmy Baldwin said this, but you know, reading past examples of other people's struggles makes you feel like you're less alone. He alluded to something like that, I believe. So yeah, organizing. And people think it's that type of organizing and activism that causes that trauma, but it should be opposite that. You know what I'm saying? That collectivity, that community building is actually self-care. And the eventual getting rid of the self, the individualized self. But we could talk about that later.
So I make sure that this is something that's in practice. You know, I make sure, as busy as the day gets, to ground with my partner and have dinner. You know what I mean? And make sure that that's kind of a point where I take a deep breath and just check in. You know. I also am part of a poetry circle, so I make sure that I don't miss my poetry circle meetings, you know what I mean, and write. And I make sure I take walks with Elizabeth Robinson.
I wanted to just say something about, you know, doing this kind of work in these times. I mean, doing this work, doing the work that we're all talking about variously up here on this panel. It's not easy, you know. I mean, I think the people who are called to it are really called to it, you know, and so but at the same time, we're called to it because there's a lot of reward here so especially in coming to the world, bringing something like this into the world, which is, you know, it's not easy work, but at the same time, it's its own reward because we get to recognize not just the folks who are in here, but also these traditions of resistance that are themselves more than anything indicative of and representative of who we are as people. And so many times I think the narrative becomes, how do we get over feeling so beleaguered all of the time by all of this work? Well, for many of us, the work is the energy and the work of remembering, as Thabisile is saying, the energy that people gave and inspired and incited and animated, even when there were generations both before and after that were never going to see freedom, nonetheless still struggled because it was the right thing to do. And that in and of itself sometimes has to be the reward, and it's a good one, and it's good enough, you know. And so, right, exactly. It is.
Better than any of the kind of the bourgeois ways we might think about self-care sometimes. That
Right.
trumps it.
Yeah. No pun intended. But I mean, partly I bring this up to kind of to bring us back to this notion of a future, and that is, you know, how do you create a future and a vision of some kind of democratic understanding of what could be when you've never seen it before? You know, and that's what we have here. We have the legacy of that here, and that's what we have in certainly in Robinson's writings, but all of the people that he was so inspired by and tried to elevate. And here, to have these authors do the same for a teacher, but also to say this is how it works, because this is always how we've done it. Usually not in a book bound between covers, but actually in ways that nonetheless make history all the time.
Yeah, I think this is such an important point because one day, I mean, I left here real miserable one time. Like, my students just, like, the undergrads that I just went through successions of, like, don't you get this? And they're like, nah. And then, you know, so it's this entire fight with students. And then I leave, and I'm like, man, I hate this school. Like, why am I even here? Like, students don't care. They're just here to get a degree. And I felt very uninspired. And so, like, the way that, in terms of the point that Thabisile brought up that I feel like is so important is what healed me was we were teaching a class up in Silmore at a detention center at a juvenile detention center. And we had a conversation about liberation consciousness that ended up in the Matrix. And it was one of the most rewarding conversations I've ever had with some of the most brilliant students that I've ever had. And that it was the work that was the healing. It just had to find it. And so basically the short of it was just that you go home and you identify where it is and you make sure you go back.
I'm not good at this yet, but I think I agree with the work aspect that people have been saying, but also humor. Finding something to laugh at. Usually when I'm with these folks, it's usually me. I just show up and get roasted, but
he's not allowed to live.
But yeah, humor, stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
Laugh at something.
Which is a very integral part of the Black radical tradition.
True.
And like that's endless.
Right, it's like shout out R.I.P. to Dick Gregory. You know, I immediately thought of him as you were saying that. He's not the only person, but I think, you know, you're spot on. And are there other questions? Yes. Tell us who you be, where you from. Let's see, we're gonna, one second. Here we go.
I definitely
There you
need
go.
mic.
Yeah.
Marwa and
Yeah, you gotta pull it up to yourself like this. Yeah, there you go.
So does it work?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm in the comparative literature department, second year, and a question I had was regarding what you guys were talking about with regards to the university as reproducing this kind of like just basically unhealthy environments. And I had a question more so like about, so a lot of times like as a graduate student I experienced that there's sort of like the separation between, I think like what Afro-pessimists would say, like people of the mind and people of the body, where you find like a majority of Black undergraduate students and are like athletes or, you know, participating in sports, but then you go to the classroom and it's not the case. So how do we create, or how do we influence the institution to recognize that Black people can be like students and to kind of create environments for them to thrive, as opposed to environments for them to feel like they're not capable of participating, especially given that a lot of, I mean, the reality is that you do have to have some type of like training to be in school, like, and I find in graduate school it's the case as well, where like people who come in with more private school educations, they have an easier time with grad school, as opposed to people who mostly have gone to public school.
And so what I'm hearing here, just to translate from here to there, is a question that in some ways returns back to a point that was brought up at the earlier part of comments, which is something I believe that Professor Dr. Jonathan Gomez mentioned earlier, and that is he was upset with the university and saying this university could be all of these things, and Professor Robinson saying, but it doesn't love you, so how are you going to make it love you? So taking that line, which I hear there, and bringing it back to the panel, what are ways that we can make institutions love us or force them to do such? Is there a possibility? No. Wait, but this is the question. Is there a possibility? If not, why? If so, why? There we go.
Jonathan, you want to start?
Yeah. So, you know, for me about that question, you know, about what spaces I was going to create for myself. I mean, going back to what Thabisile had said earlier about, you know, doing the work, or what Marcus had said as well, for me, that was going and grounding with and creating a program to work with youth at a continuation high school that were, you know, in Santa Barbara, oftentimes you don't, you know, think of, you know, overlooked and impoverished communities, but they're there, they live in the barrios, they do the work, they're the ones that make, you know, Santa Barbara the community that everyone wants to visit for vacation, you know what I mean? But I was working with youth, you know what I mean? So that space for me was utilizing the resources of the university for a community of youth that were overlooked, hyper-policed, yet underserved, you know what I mean? And so that space was where I could draw up some questions from the experiences that the youth were talking about in their poetry, right? Where they were, you know, they were there because they were in trouble for talking back, right? And when we grounded together, we were able to use their ability to talk back as an art form, you know what I mean? And they were able to speak to conditions, and that informed the kind of questions and the rigorous that I brought to it, you know what I mean? So for me, it wasn't like, let me figure out how this place can love me, you know what I mean? Because I don't think that, personally, that's not what I've been attempting to do, but more about the spaces where I can ground with people honestly, openly, and, you know, we can figure out the things that divide us to really figure out the other things that might unite us. You know what I mean? So, you know.
Yeah, like I think this might have been Fred Moten too, but I think we asked a question like this before, something like that, and I think he said we're given or it might have been Robin Kelly actually.
It was in Black Study, Black Struggle. He talks about it.
Yeah.
The
Oh
university
yeah.
is irredeemable.
Well, and we're giving the university too much power. Yeah. Have you ever broken bread with the university, drank with the university, laughed with the university? They ever came to your house when you were sick? The university ain't shit. Like there is no relationship to have with the university. The people that you're gonna do that with. So this is what the Undercommons of Freedom School is, and the lessons in the Futures of Black Radicalism and Cedric's work is a form of marriage. And you don't have to leave the university. You just get you and some of your peoples together and you claim some space on campus. And you drink and you party and you laugh and you tell jokes and you clown on each other and you write poetry. Yeah, and so that's really there's the university. You don't owe the university that kind of power. You already have it. You already have it with your peoples. So create space And one way that we did that, in part, was to create the Undercommons, which was a freedom school. And we just occupied space. We just did the big Jan steps, and we just held classes. And then we took a big 4-foot speaker and we turned on some music super loud. And you know, people were bringing like ceviche and just whatever. And we was just kicking it, and Femi had his guitar. You just post up, and then people are walking by like, what are you doing? It's like, we just kicking it. And they're like, oh shit. And then they come and kick it too, and then you meet people. So yeah. And if you're interested, then you know we stopped doing it. But if you're interested with your peoples, to bring back the Undercommons back on Jan steps and create that community, we're definitely willing to help out and reestablish that.
I mean, I don't even know why we want the university's love, truth be told. Like, what is that? If we got it, what would that look like? Because if it looks like what these white kids have, I don't want that. You know, they go in and give fancy cafeteria meals, but then, you know, subject students to sexual harassment, or protect professors that do. They're stealing from everybody's tuition. It's like, I don't think the people that are doing the best comparatively right now have a relationship with the university that I want to have. So if that's what love from the university looks like, I'm not interested in it. I'm interested in something else. I'm interested in a different kind of university altogether. And if we can't get that, we can get an Undercommons. So, you know, I'll settle for that.
Yeah. Over here. There was a mic once upon a time not long ago.
I'm Christian. I'm a postdoc in FAM here. One of the characteristics of being American is kind of relentless positivity, which can affect talking about the future, right? Like, wait, sorry? No. In terms of like our discussions about the future being so oriented around building, around energy, around activity, and I'm wondering about what are the practices of and work of mourning in building futures, and not just moving so too quickly into the future. And I don't mean that in a personalized sense, because there's an obvious context for that here. But you know, in David Scott's work talking about revolutions in the 20th century and black revolutions, he talks about not just that we have lost so many engagements in revolutionary practice and radicalism, and part of the experience of being a leftist or radical is losing and dealing with loss, but also that we have lost the certainty of a revolutionary future, the idea that the revolution will come, that these radical futures will be there. Fred Moten has talked about how one of the fundamental goals of black studies is to save the world, or to at least save the possibility of human existence on it, and that brings up the possibility that that future might not exist, or might not exist for us, that we could lose, that we might be running out of time, and that brings up a kind of anticipatory mourning sometimes in me that, yeah, we might lose. So to go from starting with positive to I don't want to get too dark, but what, how do you deal with mourning and loss in building black radical futures, I guess, is the ultimate question.
Let's go first. I have an answer. There's no difference for me in the mourning and the celebration. Whenever I lost, like when we lose folks in this city, we listen to Tupac. And it's all wrapped up in the same thing. And then when you go to church and you lose people, people in church, you losing something every week. And that's the reason why you go to church. You're going there to mourn and you're going there to celebrate. So the mourning is part of the regeneration, at least the way that I see it with black folks, and the way that I've understood it. So like in the beginning, it'll be you know, especially when you're burying elders or anybody, because when you're black, you're burying them all from infants to elders. And when you lose them, like, you know, and it happens in kind of a timeline. It's like you get there and, you know, and folks are laughing right away, you know. They're laughing at the repast. They're talking about who made the mac and cheese because it's nasty. Like, it's never been one or the other. It's always been all bound up. And I think one of the main things that I don't think in this is specific to blackness, but has happened through black practices. One of the foundational parts of mourning are memory, and in memory there's regeneration, and in memory regeneration there's testimony. And so all of these things get wrapped up in black practices that I'm rooting in Christianity and religion. Doesn't necessarily have to be, like with the example of hip hop, but these things are constantly happening through testimony, through memory, through laughter, through crying, all bound up together in the church, on the street corner, wherever we are, you know, because the timeline of death in the black community, war with the grieved and oppressed communities, is never like this kind of span of life. Like, we have infants and they get to live all the way to they're 100 years old. It doesn't happen like that. Some of the first people that I buried were kids, you know, who got shot down. And that fucks up your whole timeline when you're like 13 and you're burying other 13-year-olds, or somebody who's 17, or somebody that got shot on their 20th birthday. Messes up your whole timeline. So you have to have a way of, like, how do we make this matter, you know? And the way that we make it matter is one of the main ones is through testimony and laughter. Remember that one time when Baby Drawdown shot me with the paintball gun over by the cut, and we laughed. Yeah, it's a true story. Yeah. So I mean, that's the way I see it. I've never separated grieving with celebration.
Yeah, that reminds me of the hashtag facts, you know, as they say. And I think more generally, something I would ask the panelists as folks who are looking in on the volume, you know, what are things that it sort of, it brings to you or distills for you? Knowing Professor Robinson and also knowing the editors, what do you see in that? What is the spirit of the volume that stays with you as some final comments for this part of the program?
I just got to talking, so.
It's kind of going back to what I mentioned a little earlier about you know, connection, right? Collaboration, right? When I look at the volume and I read through it, even if I don't know those folks personally, right? I know that I'm a part of this tradition, right? I do know, you know, Professor Johnson is on my dissertation committee, right? So I had the opportunity to be mentored by her, right? But that's one thing that I take away from the Black radical tradition, that, you know, even in the midst of the chaos that the university can create for, you know, individuals as well as collective lives, there is this tremendous responsibility of mentorship, and there is also just this accountability to create space for others to engage in the ongoing conversation that's taking place. You know what I mean? So I see that, right? And right now at UCSB, we have, at the Center for Black Studies Research, we have a reading series that this quarter we're reading Black Marxism. Next quarter we're reading 2 books by Professor Clyde Woods, and then in the spring we are reading The Futures of Black Radicalism, right? And one thing that's so, you know, that for me it's so empowering is to see the intergenerational conversation that's taking place, where just the last time they had met, while George Lipsitz had facilitated the conversation, you have a first-year student engaged in the conversation, first-year undergraduate, right? Yeah, as well as graduate students and other professors at different ranks. You know what I mean? And to see that, for me, it's that's what it's about. You know what I mean? So.
And thank you for shouting out the blues epistemology. Shout out to Professor Clyde Woods. Yeah.
One thing that's always struck me about Professor Robinson's work is I think a kind of bravery and a kind of courage that takes to write the way that he writes, write the way that he wrote. When you're trying to figure out how the world works at scale, the whole thing as a system, everything that you say opens you up to criticism. I'm like on page 72, and he's talking about, you know, the canals in Venice in the 14th century, and I turned the page, talking about 16th century Senegambia. Like, there's people that study each of those things just by themselves. And you know, I think it takes a kind of, it takes a kind of intellectual honesty as well as courage to say, this is how I think the world works, and I'm gonna take that wherever it goes. And what encourages me about Futures of Black Radicalism is I see the same thing in the essays. Like, this is the thing people are trying to do, and people accept, you know, whatever the risks that are involved with that. They accept, more importantly, the responsibility that's involved in that. And I think that's the way the future has to go for all of us.
I agree with Femi. I'm sitting here trying to think about what inspires me most about Cedric and about Black Marxism and his work and about Futures. And it truly is his investment in unpopular truths, because they often hold the most profound meat in it. And it's dangerous, you know, there's no accolades that come along with it. You won't even be, quote unquote, recognized in the ways that people find meaningful in this day and age. But it's so enduring and it's so potent, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, and it's, you know, I'm still working towards telling that truth in essence. But it's fun, you know. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, to what, just real quick to what Femi said, one time Professor Robin Kelly was clowning on us in class, and when we were talking about Du Bois, well, most of the time, but a specific clowning on us very specifically, and was like, because I think he had asked us a question, and we were reading Black Marxism, and he asked us a question, and he was like, all right, so what do y'all think? And everybody was like, oh, my research, this, that, and the other. And he was like, see, this is the problem. Like, you all can't talk about shit unless it's like right through your research. So it was that issue, is about we're not, we're academics and not intellectuals. So that was just a funny story. But about Futures, one of my favorite lines in the book on page 86, and just generally as a representation of the book and why I feel like it's incredibly dangerous, is I've been going back and I've been learning these lessons that everybody here has been teaching me, and you know, Professor Robinson had been teaching me, and others have been teaching me. And it was always this thing about mouse from Devil in a Blue Dress. And I could never get what it was about mouse. Like, what was it? And so this particular code, he goes, on page 86, the play, as Callahan and Nahum Chandler teach us, is to desentiment, to exfoliate, to renew the earthly and inseparable assembly, the habitual jam, by way of and in differentiation of what will be neither regulated nor understood. All we got is us in this continual giving away of all. And as Robinson also took great care to teach us in his critical admiration of Easy's friend Mouse, who is always about to blow off somebody's nose off, all depends on our readiness to defend it. Yeah, this text, the reason why Professor Robinson was so dangerous, the reason why this text is so dangerous, the reason why Black radicalism is so dangerous is this. It's assembly and friendship. It's that easy. It seems like it's like, and I didn't get it. I didn't get it till like the day before yesterday. But this isn't an easy friendship, and that's the reason why Mouse is such a great representation of it, because friendship is militant. And it's principled, and that was the thing about Mouse. Mouse didn't ask first, like, well, you know, am I gonna get fired from my job? Da, 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 da. No, if something was going down, Mouse was there. Mouse was ready to act, and that's what's so profound about, especially in forgeries, and in so much of the work, is to understand the danger in friendship. but those friendships that you have to make across divides in racial capitalism. If you start making friends with folks you're not supposed to be friends with, that's a problem, and that's dangerous. Dangerous assembly, dangerous assembly, dangerous assembly. Who are the people you are not supposed to be with? Rural folks, white folks, poor white folks, debtors, whoever they are, gay folks, trans folks, whoever you're not supposed to be with, get with them people. And that's what it's taught. And then so it's right there, get with them people and protect those friendships. Don't protect your job. Don't protect your professionalism. Don't protect who gives a shit? Protect your friends. And that's everything.
And on that note, we can have a round of applause for our first setup. And so now we're going to do a slight transition. I'm going to invite the next set of folks up, and also I will do a round of introduction for those folks. And then once we transition, I have a video I'm going to play, and then we'll go into course number 2. All right? So take a couple minutes, folks, if you are next up.
Reflection don't mean a thing. Ooh, complexion. Two steps.
Exit out of that, and it's on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
So
all right. Yeah.
Play it
Oh,
on
yeah. I
full
got you.
screen,
Yeah.
and we should be
Yep.
good to go.
Works for me. Okay, perfect. Oh, really? Oh, thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you. Ah. Ah, thank you. Oh, thank you. Hopefully I can keep this up. Okay, hi everybody. We're coming back. Can you clap once if you hear me? Can you clap twice if you hear me? Can you clap 3 times if you hear me? Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for coming back after our short break. And before we begin our next course, as I've been calling them, I have the great pleasure and distinct honor of bringing us Elizabeth Robinson, who's been a longtime radio director at KCSB, and also a public advocate for public radio, public intellectual production, and also the lifelong partner of Cedric Robinson. Can you all give me a round of applause for Elizabeth Robinson? Thank you.
I always caution people about applauding before you've heard what somebody has to say, and I'll do that one more time. And I'm just going to do one little correction. I wasn't a public radio anything. I'm a community radio activist, and there's a real difference. Yes, advocate and activist. I just wanted to say a couple of things as I listened to the brilliant remarks of the students and former students a little bit ago. And I'm not sure exactly how to do it. There are a couple things I wanted to say in terms of where we go for knowledge. And one of them is from my own family. I had a great aunt who had a dispute with my grandfather, who they all were Arab Americans. And she wanted to vote for a woman for governor of the state of Texas in the maybe 1920s, a woman known as Ma Ferguson. And my grandfather told her if she did that, he'd never speak to her again. So her response was to put a photo or a flyer for Ma Ferguson above her bed in her bedroom. Sort of was a little in his face too. But it's the kind of tiny acts of resistance that we can all go to in our own experiences, I think. And so that's the outside of the institution part that we have to remember. On the other hand, although I think these are hostile places to us very often, and don't disagree at all with anything that was said earlier, sometimes we have to know what the tools of the institution or of the dominant culture are in order to be able to fight them effectively. And so, for example, I learned from being Cedric's first editor, and I always say, even when I didn't understand what he was saying, that there were these 2 men, white men, Kuhn and Popper, who argued about the nature of science. And one of them said, you know, there's a paradigm shift, new knowledge comes forward, and then people go about working that new paradigm. The other one said, well, yeah, that paradigm shift happens, and then rather than good new science being produced, the next 20 or 30 years are spent proving the paradigm. And so it's non-critical or uncritical scholarship. And that's where I think sometimes, that's where Cedric began to critique the discipline of political science or the social sciences by looking for the cracks and the irrationality in all that was being presented to us as rational. So that's really what I want to say, and to echo what all of the first panel said about the importance of us to us. And the us can be as inclusive as you make it, as long as you're clear about what you're about. You know, a different way that Cedric sometimes said it, or maybe I said it, one of us said it, get confused sometime, is that if you're comfortable in these institutions, you need to check yourself. Because you may be able to do good work, you may be able to shift it, you may succeed in tearing little bits of it down. But if you're comfortable, you need to check yourself. Why am I comfortable here? As Jonathan said, they don't love me here. And I think we need to remember those things. So the final thing in terms of self-care that I wanted to say, I think one of the things that Cedric and I always did was, no matter whether I was studying for exams or he was writing a manuscript or whatever we were doing, we played tennis probably 5 times a week. And we didn't play games because he was way stronger than I was, and he could beat me soundly any day of the week. But we did that. And I had a grad student friend complain to me one day about another professor who did that. And I said, you know, you got to get out of this stuff sometime. And you've got to laugh. There's a lot to laugh at, including ourselves. And so I think that's really important. And then to those 2 people at this end of the panel, and those 2 at the other end, I have to slight you guys in the middle for a minute. What Futures of Black Radicalism did for me, and I think I've done this now and I'm always wrong, was to allow me to both grieve and celebrate at the same time. And I think it was Marcus who said something like that. I'm not sure which of you said it. But that's what the Futures of Black Radicalism did for me. And the book wasn't supposed to be about Cedric. It sort of morphed that way after he died. But that sense of community remained until his last days. People came to the house and celebrated, had meals with us, even when he was no longer speaking or anything else. And some of those people are at the table too. So I thank them, and I thank all of you for coming out and participating in this today. Thank you for giving me some time.
I don't know how I followed that, other than to say that was awesome. And also, I think a reflection of the importance of the work, especially in these times, you know. And with that in mind, I want to introduce from the far right over. So first we have Damian Sojourner. He is an assistant professor at the University of California, Irvine, in the Department of Anthropology. His research focuses on the relationship among the public education system, prisons, and the construction of Black masculinity in Southern California. Next to him, we have our very own Professor Shana Redmond, Associate Professor in Musicology and also African American Studies. She is author of the book that I cite all the time, Anthem. If you want to know what it means, what it's about, and how it travels, you need to read the book, okay? She wrote the book, that's as people say. And before I get into the middle of our Oreo sandwich, as it were, I will play a quick video just because I think it's important to see folks in action. And then I have some less action ways, meaning I will read a couple of things to properly give them an introduction. So we're gonna watch, if I can exit out of this, we're going to watch a clip from our very own visitors from the Prophets of Rage. We will see them in action, and then I will introduce them a little bit.
Those that work forces are the same that burn crosses. Some of those that work forces all the same that burn crosses. Some of those that work forces, all the same that burn crosses. Some of them that work forces, all the same that burn crosses. Now you do what they told you. 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 And 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 now you.
Right. It's an abbreviated.
There we go, right? Yeah, slightly. So next to Professor Redmond, we have the one and only Tom Morello. Incendiary rock guitarist and acoustic troubadour Tom Morello, known for his innovative guitar solos, which we heard part of there, and thunderous chords, is a groundbreaking artist, whether in his solo career or as an original member of the rock bands Rage Against the Machine and Audioslave. 2 acts responsible for multiple Grammy Awards and a combined 30 million albums sold worldwide. He released 4 solo albums as The Night Watchman and formed the band Street Sweeper Social Club with Boots Riley of The Coup in 2009. Morello has been recognized by Rolling Stone magazine as one of the 100 greatest guitar players of all time at number 26. I would say squarely in part because of the amazing work in Killing the Name on Rage Against the Machine, the album of the same title, but of course all of his work. Morello has produced or collaborated with artists of diverse genres, including the Wu-Tang Clan, Johnny Cash, Tool, John Fogerty, Anti-Flag, Public Enemy, Joe Strummer, Crystal Method, Cali 13, Dave Matthews Band, Johnny Cash, Linkin Park, Travis Barker, and Pete Seeger. In addition, he joined Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band for their 2014 World Tour in support of Springsteen's studio album High Hopes, Columbia Records, on which Morello was featured on 8 tracks. In 2016, Morello joined forces with fellow Rage Against the Machine bandmates Tim Comerford and Brad Wilk, as well as Cypress Hill's Be Real and Public Enemy's Chuck D and DJ Lord to form the band Prophets of Rage. The group came together as a politically charged response to 2016 tumultuous election year. After the 35-city trek across North America last year, they expanded the mission worldwide into 2017 with dates across Mexico, Latin America, and Europe. The band's debut self-titled album was released September 15th and scored top chart entries in multiple countries across the globe in its first week. Morello is also a valiant activist across issues of homelessness, poverty, hunger, and social justice, among other causes. Give me a round of applause for Tom Morello. So, I never thought as a black boy in South Philly that I would ever have the opportunity to do exactly what I'm about to do right now. And that is introduce the one and only, sorry to everybody else on the panel, I just have to do this, Chuck D, okay? Chuck, Mother Father D. Okay? So we know him for many things, including what I love about the clip is we see him with the megaphone, and he is hip-hop's megaphone. So it is like a double megaphone in the video. But we know him for albums from Public Enemy, including their debut album in 1987, Yo Bum Rush the Show. 1988, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. And 1990, I brought my record, Fear of a Black Man. Now there are other joints here that I could talk about, but one that I really wanted to visit with because it stays with me a lot, especially as I've been doing this whole Chocolate Cities thing and going from black place to black place, is the track on the album, Who Stole the Soul? So I'm gonna attempt to emulate the master, but just to say here, ain't no different than in South Africa. Over here, they'll go after you. To steal your soul, like over there, they stole our gold. Yo, they say the black don't know how to act. Who, me? Shout out to Flavor Flav, that's who's doing that. Because we're waiting for the big payback. So part of it is just to say that we have a master of being radical while doing hip hop music at the same damn time. And so it gives me great pleasure and it's a great honor to welcome Chuck D to the microphone, to UCLA, to AFAM, and to the program today. So we can have a round of applause for the one and only Chuck D. And they are joining our co-editors, Alex Lubin and Gaye Theresa Johnson, in what we're calling artist, activist dialogue. And so one of the very first questions I just want to start, since I have facilitators, tyranny, is to say the following. So that clip that we saw here is also for people who have, how many people have DirecTV? Nobody? Okay, I have it, okay? It's not the best cable, but I got it, okay? And why I have it is because they show all of the other stations' television in real time, so you don't have to wait for the East Coast to tell you if Love and Hip Hop was good tonight. You could just find out when you're on at the same time. But there's a feature on the Prophets of Rage that they're now showing on Audience, which is one of the stations that is only on DirecTV, hence I ask about that. But there's a part where they are talking about what it's like to work together, coming from these different groups, these different genres, and these sorts of things. And at one point, I believe it's Tom who goes on to talk about Chuck's 5 principles of music. And I think about them a lot after I saw it, in part because I think they widely apply to academic production or intellectual production and also to the book itself. And so the first step of music is that you write the song. So you write, 911 is a joke in your town. Yeah, that's so good, I'm gonna write that down, let's see what happens. And then you go and you record the song. And so you in the recording studio, you hear it going on the treble up, you hear it in the bass down, you're like, oh wait, maybe there might be something to this. So then you go and play the song. And then when you play the song, it's like, yeah, I see little people nodding their heads, 911 is a joke in their town. Like this is hitting home in some way. That playing the song allows you to then believe in the song. When you believe in the song, all of a sudden the music is like religion. Once you go beyond that, then you bleed the song, so that the song is pouring out of you in a way that is about your own sacrifice to make that intellectual product out there for other people to absorb, but also as a sheer giving yourself into the product altogether. And I think that applies a lot to the work of Cedric Robinson, that he didn't just write stuff and then play it for the masses. He believed in it. He bled it, very intensely. And so I want to start off by talking about that process and thinking about Cedric Robinson and the volume and what it means to bleed a Black radical tradition. What does it mean to do that? So that is my opening to the panelists.
Shall I? Well, thank you for the question and for the introduction. And as the sort of least cool person here, I'll start.
You're one of the co-editors. You're the reason for the season.
Okay. So, you started off by talking about how at this moment the book speaks to a certain thing. And I just want to talk for a moment about this moment. And the dean who was here earlier mentioned that it's Election Day, but it's also the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, which is another, I think, context to think about in the context of this book. But we're also living in a time where it seems that white supremacy has been given national sanction by our president. Not only because we see the alt-right on our university campuses, not only because we see marches in Charlottesville, Virginia, not only because we see people talking about blood and soil and all sorts of other anti-Black and anti-Semitic and Islamophobic rhetoric, but also because of the policies that this administration is sanctioning, from the Department of Justice's reinvocation of the war on drugs to the scaling back of social welfare programs like Medicaid. We're also seeing a specific attack on Black activism. We might think about the ways that the FBI recently classified Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization, which should remind us that the Obama administration had named Assata Shakur one of the most wanted people in America under the war on terror. So it's on the one hand a longer history, and on the other hand, we're startled because this history, this moment of virulent white supremacy is taking place in the wake of something we thought was different. Whether it was or wasn't is something to debate, but it does feel different. We experience it as different, even though obviously there's a longer history. Trump is merely invoking a longer history of white settler colonial nationalism. He's not unique in that way. One of the things that I think is so important about studying the Black radical tradition, and specifically Cedric Robinson's intervention into it, is to recognize that regimes of race, racial capitalism itself, is a fragile edifice. And something that we think is so ferocious at the moment, white supremacy, anti-black racism, right? The virulence of these things may be signs actually of their weakness rather than their strength. It may be an indication of the last days, or last years, or something that is moving from one stage to another rather than its enduring ahistorical endurance or supremacy. And I think that's one of the things that we should, and I hope this book gets at, is the idea that racial formations, racial capitalism, is an unstable edifice, something that's continually requiring cultural work to uphold itself. And Robinson always argued that it was through the forgeries of race, the forgeries of memory, the counterfeit that race is, that enables racial capitalism to endure. The other intervention I think that's really important for us in this moment is to recognize that our critique of capitalism, which I think is happening more and more as people who supported Bernie Sanders can outright say that they are socialists. We need to recognize that a critique of capitalism has to be a critique of racism, because capitalism and race were never distinct. That capitalism, there is no capitalism that is not racial capitalism. And therefore, some of the debates that we see in progressive communities between debating race versus class, which are old debates, but I think re-emergent today, really seem antiquated when we understand what racial capitalism was. And I think several authors in this book get at an understanding of racial capitalism as something that's continually partitioning the world from a colonial perspective, but also something partitioning people. As someone said earlier, it's about keeping us apart from each other, right? It's about creating partitions and, scaling off surplus from those partitions. Another important intervention that I think some of the authors in this book get at is that Black Marxism is a particular kind of philosophical intervention, a Black radical philosophical theory that precedes what we think of as Marxism today. That Black Marxism is something indigenous to a Black radical tradition that formed not necessarily in Europe, but even before Europe was invented, right? So as the students earlier were pointing out, Robinson is always, in some ways, frustrating us as readers by taking us to these pasts that are unfamiliar to some of us. And particularly, he was interested in the Mediterranean world and formations of race and pre-capitalism in the Mediterranean world and forms of resistance that emerged from the Mediterranean world. And that's because he understood that Black radicalism preceded the kind of proletarian radicalism that Marx would eventually come to understand. So Marxism is something that Robinson was interested in as a portal to understand Black radicalism, but also something he critiqued for the ways that it overlooked a longer prehistory of Black radicalism, or what he called Black Marxism. The other sort of last thing I want to point out about this moment and about this book is that Robinson's work calls for a politics of abolitionism, something that Ruthie Wilson Gilmore in this book writes about quite well, not only in terms of prison abolitionism, but an abolitionism that goes back to a concept that W.E.B. Du Bois first wrote about, of abolition democracy. And what Du Bois argues in Black Reconstruction, and that Robinson, I think, furthers, is the idea that Black liberation freed all people, right? Not just the former slaves, that Black liberation led to the franchise for so many people, led to the formation of public education across the South and throughout the nation. And so Black liberation would be one of the sites at which we could find liberation for all peoples. And I think that is the spirit in which many of the authors of this book are writing.
I'll just offer something brief, just kind of to echo some of the things that Alex said, and then also to talk about doing this work right now. Part of the reason that we have made this panel in the way that we have, asking these very particular people to be part of it, is because of the incredible interface between community, academy, and all these other different kind of facets of society and community where sometimes these dialogues that take place in rather unlikely, can we hear me? In unlikely spaces have incredibly radical results, and we want to be able to incite that, and we feel like together, these authors, when put together into this very particular kind of conversation, reminding us about the legacy of Black radicalism that we not only share and have inherited, but also have an accountability to animate and incite and to move forward with and to remember, especially now. We hope that it serves as an inspiration. For many of us who are teachers, many of us we are all teachers here on this panel in one way or another, but for those of us who engaged in the classroom, we know right now teaching about racial capitalism is a very difficult thing because it's very hard for Pete White in the house, hello. It's very hard for students, our students, especially in a traditional university like this one, where a lot of our students are undergrads who are between 18 and 22, and really have come up, even like many of us have come up in the backlash against civil rights, right? But then they've also come up in a whole other kind of backlash and are now witness to, at the kind of prime of their lives, a very insidious and also not subtle backlash that is, whose whole platform is unabashed hatred and evisceration of Black people and Black radicalism and humanity in general. And so for us, this is also about, elevating the gift of humanity that drives Black radicalism and allows us to have these very important conversations and interfaces with community in these various places. And so two of the authors that contributed here on the end, Damien Sojourner and Shana Redmond, do this as a practice in their writing, certainly as intellectuals, but also as practitioners of the Black radical tradition. And we also could think of no better folks right now, or even in the last 30 years, sorry, outing you for how long you've been professionals, more than that, that this is the work. This is the work, which is not always the most popular work, it is not always the most lucrative work, but it's nonetheless the work that once you get into it, you really do understand yourself as being accountable to a tradition of resistance that cannot, will not, and we won't allow to die or to be marginalized. We bring it back to the center over and over again. So in many ways, when we talk about in the introduction, for example, how this moment, while it makes white supremacy look incredibly strong, it actually is a sign of its fragility. In some ways, it feels like slim solace, because there's so many of us who teach so many, I have 887 students right now who look at me every day like, really, you really think it's gonna get better? Because I haven't seen that. And I have to remind them, yeah, but everything we know about our people is that even when we couldn't imagine something better, it was better. So give that anxiety not to the angst and fear, but instead in service to the love that drove people to nonetheless create incredible architectural tributes to the love that we create together, to the traditions of radicalism and persistence and humanity that we create together. So this is why we wanted to have these particular people together here talking in this way. And also because we have these incredible intellectuals here at the end of the table, they're also in some ways some of the best question askers on the planet about culture, politics, the carceral regime. And so we want to hear from you as well. And then we definitely want to hear from you all too.
And I saw Tom had something that you want to speak.
I just wanted to say that what you said was pretty cool. So you're cooler than you think, bro. You're good. Thank you. Fit right in. You're good.
Well, I wanted to say, by way of maybe drawing Tom and Chuck out a little bit in response to your question, Marcus, about how do we bleed this practice of the Black radical tradition. And I think it's precisely, for my purposes, through an everyday practice, right? That every single day you have to be thoughtful about who you are and how you move in the world. And that for me, music becomes that opportunity every single day. That living this life is like your instrument. You have to work at it every single day in order to get closer to a perfection that you may never reach, but that you're aspiring toward, because the perfection is worth it. There's something at stake in whether or not you actually work toward that perfection. And so for me, contributing to this volume was an incredible honor, and I'm humbled that Cedric and Elizabeth thought of me for this project, because it gave me an opportunity both to speak to the two of you, but also to speak to interlocutors who I don't see enough, I don't think with enough, and who I want to do more with in the future, but also to hopefully put a provocation on the table about what culture does inside of this tradition. So Theresa talked about culture masking certain types of practices, economic formations, while at the same time being very much constitutive of them and revealing them in particular ways. That's part of what culture can begin to do for the people who are actually engaging in it. But this type of engagement with the world in which we live is an everyday one through culture, right? You have an opportunity every single day to know the Black radical tradition if you're listening properly, because it's everywhere around us, that these musicians, that these composers, these performers are actually calling the question with us every single day. And I think musicians do this perhaps better than anyone else in the world, is that they insist on us being our own leaders, right? That we live our most genuine, authentic lives. And it's in part the work that they do that actually helps us to get there. So in thinking culture as kind of the central kind of pulse of the Black radical tradition, I start the chapter by asking, what do you hear when we say the words Black radical tradition? What do you hear? Not what do you see, what do you do, what do you hear, right? Because this is active. And this is how you engage with the world around you. This is how you come to understand who you are in it and what types of interventions you can make. So I want to make sure that as we're thinking about these two scholars that are sitting in the middle of the table, that we also consider how we've arrived at them, how we've arrived at their work, at the types of questions and provocations that they're putting in front of us, because we are a part of who they've become as well.
When you asked the question, I thought about the keynote address that Cedric gave at the Critical Ethnic Studies Association conference in Chicago. And he talked about Black Marxism being a metaphysical text. And I didn't exactly know where he was going with that when he said it. You know, I know a lot. It's discussed in the book about this contestation between Christianity and the ways that Christianity attempts to dominate. But then the more that he talked about it, and the more in our conversations, it became quite clear that it's a way in which Blackness is made not seen, invisible, cannot be read because of the metaphysical practices explored by Black people. And to a very certain extent, I think it was our job in the book to make those practices known and to make them to be heard and to be seen as both a practice of, you know, countering this logic of Western forms of Christian domination, but then also to see how, in fact, that it's not a top-down model, as Alex was talking about, right? That race is extremely, extremely fragile, and it's easily exposed, right? It doesn't take much at all. Matter of fact, just looking at that video of who was there in that audience, who's performing, like these notions, these very binary notions of white and Black just get exploded very quickly, as Shana was saying, often through music. But I think in particular, the types of questions that we ask in the text are important to wrestle with. On one hand, you know, to think about how the future is going to look, but then also to understand that the answers are already there. That it's not necessarily you have to go searching sort of far and wide. It's a matter of talking to people who are immediately next to you. And then those conversations just naturally lend themselves and like, oh, I talked to this person, X, Y, and Z. But I think another thing that I was thinking about as well, and I was trying to figure out how to bridge this, and there's no way else, so I'm not going to try to do it. But there was this conversation about humor that was on the previous panel, and Cedric was one of the funniest people alive that I ever knew. But his humor was so dry. And I remember he told me this story of getting stopped by the police right after, I think it was an ACLU meeting that was being had, and the police, you know, was like, "What do you have in your briefcase?" And he looked at him, he said, "Fried chicken," right? And so I tell that story to say that there is a particular level of the wit and brilliance of Cedric was not just sort of in this sort of a illogical or it couldn't be touched type of way. It resonated from black people, right? So that these stories, growing up in Oakland, all of this carried with Cedric all the time, right? So that you can read his writing, but remember where he came from, especially when you talk to him, and you can see all the way that, you know, in anthropology they call like folkways, whatever, right? But the way that humor, his love for music, for jazz and blues, he kind of was a little bit against hip hop in some ways, but then sort of slowly came to it. But how all of that informed his way of being, but then also how he wrote about black people and had a profound love for blackness. That was just something that it's hard to articulate from one person, which I think why the book is so beautiful, because you get all these perspectives of how it's done.
Any questions?
Well, I mean, I think I'm the only one on the panel that hasn't read the book, so I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to tell you how my personal experience as a self-identifying black radical harmonizes with some of the things that have been discussed so far. I literally integrated the town of Libertyville, Illinois, a small northern suburb of Chicago. According to the real estate agent, I was the first person of color to reside within its borders in 1965. So 2 questions which are often asked in rock magazines and guitar magazines and stuff is, one, well, how were you radicalized? You know, was it a Howard Zinn book, or was it, no, it was when people called me the N-word when I was 4 years old on the playground, you know, and we had a noose in my family's garage. Like, that's when I first became associated with injustice. The second question they ask is like, so what are some of your major influences as a guitarist? And I say, well, Huey Newton and Malcolm X and Che Guevara and the Weather Underground. I didn't choose to be a guitar player. That's my vocation. That chose me, that was my calling. Being stuck as a guitar player, I had to find a way to weave my convictions into what I do. And what we do in 2017 with Prophets of Rage, Chuck and I, is at each and every show, we try to create a little bit of the world we'd like to one day see in that moment and on that night. And it's a world of resistance, it's a world of celebration, it's a world of gathering the tribes together, it's a world of both pride and acceptance beyond sort of normal parameters. And my mom, who's 94, is here today. She's this lady here, and she raised a very radical black person in an all-white town. I have to give her thanks for that. But thank you very much for having us on the panel. If there's any specific questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Mr. Chuck D, a hard rhymer.
Well, I'd like to also build on the fact that what you said and what Alex said in the beginning, that when he was like saying he's the least coolest on the panel, I was like, everybody on this panel knows that I'm the least coolest. And I say that just to also reflect the time that we're in, to also say it had to like sink into me the honor of being able to have conversations with Cedric and Elizabeth, my in-laws, Gaye, of course, you know, and people on this panel on different times, because we're in a time where we have to know our place as culturalists. I was raised sort of like to be a child of the arts in the year of 1960. But in my first 10 years of my life, my parents made me recognize the world around me. And when I looked at the television and I looked at these conversations that were similar to the panel discussions that we might think is too deep today, but this was the average conversation on a black and white TV in 1964, 66, and 67 discussing a war or assassinations and all these other things, and you're like, and I'm taking it in the first 10 years of my life. But growing up as an artist, I knew to reflect these things, and also later on in life knowing that, Harry Belafonte was an activist who sacrificed his career. Dick Gregory was a brother who came to my university along with Angela Davis and turned me out in the early 80s to say, hey, you can do both, Dick Gregory. You could be funny, and at the end of the day, you could be dead serious. And also hearing Harry Belafonte, who inducted us into the Rock Hall of Fame in 2013, also saying that his hero was Paul Robeson, who also was vilified in the United States of America. The reason I just say to know your place is today, you know, like the perception of the musician or the raptivist or whatever is the hip way to go, or the way to actually have a balanced way to speak to the crowd and also roll with the intellectual. But the games are always played every year, and young people come in and young people go. And I had the pleasure of having conversations with Cedric and Clyde Woods, you know, Gaye's colleague, and knowing that their works are in words, the patience of them writing the words to try to push a change into this world has to be able to be listened to, read, and also processed by those that have ability to process it into practicality, make it work in everyday life. And I know us as a musician, you know, the first thing people tell us is like, we're a group of musicians from the United States of America. That's fine, but we're in the whole damn planet Earth. So how do we process this into practicality? You know, to be called a radical means what? You know, every day of your life being called somebody who's strange, or knowing that I've never put any faith in any government, so therefore you know that you're an anarchist or a dissident. I never really put much faith in a religion, so you're a heathen, or what's the other one? Antichrist or something like that. So from anarchist to antichrist, and you know all these games that's being played by you taking a radical step in whatever direction to keep what bread and circuses used to be called in the past, or what Biggie said in 1994 by calling it party and bullshit. But these are the things and that people do and what they're into. The context of how important the readers and the writers are in these societies, because people come and they go. But the word to try to tinker and get under the hood of all the bullshit that's going around has to also lie into our intellectuals that process that down to people that do things every day in their life, and when they do things every day in their life. I understand, you know, and brother, you're phenomenal. You're phenomenal. And this panel before us was phenomenal. Friends are very important. And also it pains me to see that I'm friends of the King family and Malcolm family, and I know their families were placed upon society as being, I guess, the figurative families of royalty of black movements in the time that we've lived, and I've seen their families left out for dry. I mean, I've seen people use their name, their image, and everything, and their families have struggled, and they're struggling. And now with the new games being played in this world, the United States of America, I've said this quite frankly, anything being chained to this country, this 48 state, disunited state, 2,000 by 3,000 mile box, you're forever a slave here. You have to be not in what they call in basketball, going ISO. Being ISO here is a slave. You got to be able to expand to the rest of the world, think global, act global, but you got to get there. And the philosophers can at least take you there. They can even take you off the planet, which might be a place to start thinking. And those that ain't able to think, you better get up in their grill and box that out or something. Because, and I say this to be quick about it, that to be honest and truthful about your movement, like this brother named, his poetry, he's like a spitting poet. He's like, he rhymes, but also he does poetry, spoken word, which is both the same thing when you elevate it. He says, you know, I keep it 99 sometimes because, you know, I be lying. You know, so he says, I be lying. Yeah, he says, I'm 99 because I be lying sometime. And I was like, whoa. Because everybody talk about keeping it 100, but he says, no, I'm 99 because of society. The society is not going to keep it 100. So you got to be on that same wavelength. And right now, you know, music today, we deliver music which is sight, sound, story, and style. These are 4 things coming at the senses. This is young people. You can't just play music for a person that's 12 years old and think they're going to just receive it with their ears and process it. Everything is coming at them at the same time. This is like no other time before. And of course, they're going to place culture as being the leading beacon for any change or radicalism. And I would say that that, of course, is a trick. It's a trick. We're musicians. Tom says it best. We create change in a short matter of time in the mosh pit, in the lyrics, in the music, in the notes. But that's going to be boom, 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 and it's back to the regular world, 23 hours a day. And that's where that change has to also reinforce and say, oh, look, we could point to the intellectuals. We could point to the professors. We could point to the teachers. And in our community, we have to point to those who have written and who have read as being the coolest. And if they're not cool, we gotta somehow make it be the coolest, and we have to fight for that, because that's the game that this whatever this media or whatever you want to call it has tricked it into everybody watching the culturalists for the idea or the narrative. And the ones that read and the ones that write will control the narrative in the next 50 to 100 years. And we've gotten away from that in the last 25 to 30 years. And I don't know how it comes back unless you think internationally. Because when I was 10 years old, I knew about a Patrice Lumumba at 10 years old without trying to be brainy. It was just in the atmosphere. It was in the air. You pull it down, and all of a sudden that your community is moving around where you're pulling down things that kind of elevate you on GP. Where is it today if you're going to actually say it's going to be in somebody's lyrics that come across on one of DirecTV or one of these channels? I don't think so. I think we hit hard. There's a lot of people who are converted there, but the masses are still them asses. And that's the way they want to keep that. And so my question is, like, yes, pumping up the volume to a reduced society is necessary. How close can we pump up the volume and dance close to the heat without getting burnt up? Because you know, we have thinkers, we have movers and shakers, but young people come in and old people pass on. And that's just the thing that we've never been able to conquer. And the closer we can get is in the written word, and I wouldn't say documentaries and film and all this other stuff. It's overrated. It's just like a movie. A movie will give you 2 hours, but it's just 2 hours. It's not going to give you the whole picture. A book and being able to talk to somebody that could process it, you could keep with you. I know I do a lot of digital work on iPad. I can do a lot of stuff. But when I keep a book with me, I can make sure that I make some artwork on my time, line by line, in detail. And I can go back and I can say, well, boom, this is the finished result, whether it took me 10 years or whether it took me 1 year. And whoever receives that is going to be the beneficiary of change in the narrative in the next 50 years. If a lot of these places are still around. So yeah, so the coolest pretty much people have listened to from this panel, and that goes for everybody on this panel. I listen to him like, and this lady right here all the time. It's like, so I mean, to come out of this with nothing and be able to process it into something who might be looking at like, what does this mean for me? You got to kind of like deliver quick. You got to absorb slowly, but deliver quick to the masses coming up next. That's just my opinion. So that's, to me, radicalism. Can I afford to be called an antichrist or a bastard or whatever? You're going to have to take that hit in order to make some change.
What he said. Questions? Comments? Yeah, here.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, tell us who you be, where you from?
I be Lafifia Lewis.
Thank you.
I'm a proud transfer student. Currently an undergrad double majoring in African American studies and history, as well as minoring in Chicana studies.
Awesome.
Thank you. We opened up the panel earlier talking about spaces and creating these spaces and carving out spaces for ourselves, and mainly being in spaces that were not really built for us. And so part of my frustration as a student and a self-proclaimed social activist, I'm just curious, do you see a time where we will no longer be cultural excavators, where we have to always carve out spaces for ourselves just to exist minimally? And my second question, I'm sorry I didn't mention I had
go
to,
ahead.
but my second question is also, I did not have the honor of reading the book yet, but
Books are available outside in the back for purchase.
and I'll definitely get one. For those who have, and especially to the editors, one of my favorite perspectives. What are some of the forms of radicalism that the book discussed that suggests would be, I guess, that will produce the greatest potential for social justice?
And so from what I hear, just to translate a little bit, I hear two questions. The first question is there a place or a space that may or does exist? So that in some ways is asking when, for example, Tom, you were mentioning how for, even if it's just that set, you know, you're creating some better version of what we have. Is that on purpose, and is that to create something that you believe to be possible? And then the second question is, what kinds of practical or praxis about Black radicalism are available to us vis-a-vis the book, or just more generally? Because I think when people hear Black radical, people think either you is or you ain't. You know, either you're conservative, you're progressive, you're definitely not radical. So what does that mean, and how are people able to practice that? I think were the two things that I heard there.
Like I said, just for me, I always found my space in action. You know, I was an avid reader, but it wasn't till I helped form an underground paper in my high school where the rubber hit the road. And the high school shut down the paper. We contacted the ACLU, and we taught the high school administration a civics lesson at 16 years old. And I was like, oh, this is home for me. Like it's sort of the text came to life. And then when I was in college at Harvard University, it was during the anti-apartheid movement, and we were trying to get the university to divest. And it felt like the heroes that I was reading about, sort of the social justice warriors, it made me realize that me and my friends, we were no smarter or had no more courage than them. We just did it. If you go out the door and you do it, like we made that space, and we built a shanty town in Harvard Yard to the embarrassment of the administration during the time of year when like the big funding drive, so the people come back for the football game, and the Harvard Yard looks horrible because there's a Joburg, a Soweto shantytown in Harvard Yard. And you know, I don't know, in 2017, I'm not sure what the equivalents are, but for someone who aspired to change the world, I kind of stopped asking people how to do it and just like, me and my friends were going to try something today. And in that space, and when you do something, things happen, I learned. And it was those were two very formative experiences that led to many other experiences through my life as an activist and as a musician. But they taught me the lesson that like my space is one that I'm going to have to create, and nobody's necessarily going to hand it to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think what
No.
Were you gonna say something, Chuck?
No. I was just. I had a thought, and I said, what good is it? No, because I know that a lot of times that people talk, you know, and we hear this a lot. You know, hey, Tom, Chuck, I want to change the world, but I'm like, if you can't change your mind, how are you going to change anything else past that? Right. You got to be able to change your mind sometime to change anything past that. And this is what we try to get across. This man's a firm believer of make it happen, because people make it happen. If you don't make it happen, it's a possibility it never will happen. So you got to make it happen. And we've got to fight sometimes to make it happen. You have to really kind of like fight like your lungs fight for air. You know, you just got to go at it.
And also, and courage is contagious. You know, that's one thing that I found, is that in those moments where I've seen someone risk in order to stop a bully or to do the right thing or to say the right thing, and sometimes there are consequences, but that has encouraged me in another time to stand up and have some courage, which maybe is encouraging. Like the record that you held up there. I mean, that is an act of courage. Like, that's not the kind. That's not a record that's aiming for the top of the charts. It's a different way of going about looking at your life and what it is that how your convictions can be woven into your vocation. And the courage that Public Enemy had is one of the building blocks of Rage Against the Machine. We're like we're not going to try to sell any records. We're going to say what we mean and let the chips fall where they may. And it was Chuck's and Public Enemy's act of courage that led to our sort of stepping outside of the safety parameters of the music industry to say what we wanted to say.
You know, culture also allows you to put animosity in certain pockets. Like, yeah, I'm making that record. I'm mad as fuck, man. It's like, you know, and you know, I mean, seriously, culture allows you to put anger in areas, and this is one of the reasons why they've made these societies, especially this society, downplay academia, and especially with academics and education when it comes down to people of color and black people, because with this understanding of knowledge comes this understanding of this animosity. And this animosity, everybody that is not like an artist or a musician, they could put it in a cultural pocket and then shoot it out, you know, and people could be like, all right, I'm gonna box somebody or I'm gonna dance to it. The average person is like, all right, what the fuck I do with this animosity now? How do I process this? And you have the powers that be that kind of know this, but also don't know that with this education or this positive elevation always corrects errors, peace, that there is a road to a peace, but you got to fight for that peace. And this is some of the confusions that are popping up in saying, you know what, culture has all the answers, and maybe they could just lull and dull you to sleep, and you'll get, you know, a Rage Against the Machine or Public Enemy to spark up, but we're relying on that it will be 3% of the audience anyway, as 97% drift off to the toys that we wave. And, you know, with this animosity, we have to also be humble to point to the written word. And that's why I said that the fact that Gaye and Alex and Shana it kept this wonderful work by Cedric, and have you know, you have to breathe life into the words. I mean, there's always some BS preacher that's telling you that on their interpretation of whatever their holy book is. But when it comes down to information and education, it's important for culture to breathe life into our intellectuals who have taken word by word, sentiment by sentiment, second by second detail to unravel this complexity of bullshit into something concise and civil most of the time before it could get uncivil. You know, it's important for us culturalists to be able to say, that's dope. And I choose, rather than write the written word, although I've written a lot of written words, but really my foray is drawing pictures. I'd rather just draw a picture. But in my adult life, I have to put words to the pictures because people can't even process art at all. They're not trained on the arts. Before, we used to have people in our family that could understand that that's what that instrument is. This man plays a guitar. Oh, yes, I get it. Now he plays a guitar, but you know, he's known as one of the greatest guitarists of all time. What pains me in our community, who kind of like had the guitar like the turntable, which was another instrument we was once great at, that the guitar is about as foreign as, I don't know, as foreign as a plate of sushi or whatever in our neighborhood. And I'm like, wow, you know, they can't process Tom playing, but once upon a time, that was our extension. And they found a way to and I mean that by the ubiquitous they or powers that be, they found a way to put a haze on the cultural power and keep moving it. And so it takes the academic or the intellectual to be able to say, hold that, and not just holding Coltrane, because it's easy to talk about Coltrane just like a false god or prophet from some years ago, but how about somebody who's doing it right now? And what do they mean with that intent? And we need somebody that controls the narrative, and that's the academics, that's the intellectuals, because within that culture is that animosity that's harbored in that culture that academics could bring out and process to all these youth that come to UCLA, sit in a damn classroom and leave just as dumb as they came in. I came in here for 3 damn credits. I left with 3 credits. What can you use for what you learned in that class 10 years from now? And they're like, I don't fucking know. We get them all. We get them all. I mean, I thank the universe for being able to go to college during R&B. That's Reagan and Bush. Because everything I learned inside and outside the classes at Adelphi University, I've needed it in my professional life. I busted my ass for 6 years to get the 4-year degree. But 25 years later, they gave me an honorary doctorate knowing that I kicked ass for what I learned there around the world. And that's what it's all about. It's like we can't forsake the seconds that we have to absorb from books like that or professors like Gaye to be able to say, well, what can I do with what I've gotten here to take to the world and change it? You know, if you can't change your mind, you can't change a damn thing.
Right. And in a world that costs everything, changing your mind is still relatively free. You know, so that is the power of what you're saying as well, is that don't cost you nothing. You know, it's like
cheapest
manners.
Price to pay is attention.
Right, exactly. Right, manners, paying attention, these things are free, but they keep us behind, you know, because people are willing to pay what is otherwise free. I saw Shana had something. I wanted to make sure.
I was going to say something, then I thought, what's the point? No, I was just going to pick up on now what both of them have said, which is the investment in taking up space, right? But coming into those spaces knowing who you are and the type of study and struggle that has to go into the process of knowing who you are. Right, I'm very dubious, and you didn't say this, Lafifia, so I'm not making this, you know, critique of you, but of a language of safe space. Because acknowledging that there are safe spaces is also inherently an acknowledgement that there are unsafe spaces. And those are the spaces we need to be accounting for, and those are the people with whom we need to be communing, right? So we have to step into every space we're given with courage and integrity, and know that those are the spaces that we make, that we're coming into it with a certain amount of knowledge, we're coming into it with a certain amount of loving care for the other people that we inhabit those spaces with. And so to be mindful of those as choices and as practices is really important, because as we discussed earlier, nothing is given to us. Right? So we have to go to our books, we have to go to our neighbors, we have to go to our families, we have to go to our music to actually understand how we fit into these worlds that we're creating. And that's part of what was raised earlier that I want to just note here about the title, Futures, is plural. It's not singular, right? That this is not a coherent step-by-step manual to get to one definable, coherent place. There are many different places for us to go. And so somebody said earlier that we all likely believe the same things in this space. I don't believe that, actually. I think there are many divisions, even in this space. Those people who self-selected to come here, we don't all believe the same things. And so there are many different futures to arrive at or to work towards. And so the more that we can actually invest in that as a process, that we'll never perfect, but that we're working towards every day, the better off and the more meaningful every step toward it will be.
Yeah. Any questions? I see a hand here. Please say who you
Here I study geography. I think this question of accountability has run through both. I think it takes on a heightened importance with what people are saying, like the current political situation that we're in, and the responsibility that we have to people whose suffering is going to be intensified with these pre-existing forms of oppression, but then accountability within the framework of internationalism, like the threat of nuclear war against North Korea, and then humanity in general with the denial of climate change by this fascist regime that's trying to consolidate power for a year now and all of what that has caused. And so I think that this accountability actually takes a concrete form right now to drive this regime from power and prevent these catastrophes that we're facing in a very heightened way right now. And there's an organization, Refuse Fascism, that has put forward this demand to drive the regime out. And I was wondering how you all see the need to do that and how you see yourselves as academics and activists and artists in contributing to this great goal.
Thank you, and we'll take this question here. Yeah. We're at about 52, so I'm going to do the Maxine Waters at about 5 o'clock and reclaim everybody's time.
Amen. Amen. Dope. Well, I was so enthralled by that person's question, and actually will follow up nicely. So I guess just to add on, you can respond to this person here in this response. I really appreciate, Alex, what you were saying about the Mediterranean, which, as you know, is my area and lots of different levels. But I guess I was going to ask you to speak to, I mean, this went really well. So the graduate student panel, which was really collaborative and really brilliant, and then Chuck's intervention about the getting out of a US-American formation. And Marcus, perhaps, the person on the graduate student panel who was speaking about the local and what that meant, and the demands of the demands that need to be made on a public university or a public institutional space. So I was wondering if you would speak to, it sounded like that was on the political level, capital P politics, in terms of the way internationalism was being used, but perhaps to speak about it in the Marxist, communalist perspective, and how you see the relationship between the local, the global, and other formations in between being informed either from the book or in your art or activism.
Thank you. Yeah, panel.
It's a lot. It is a lot. Yeah. I'll start. To share an experience that we had, Mark and I were teaching this community scholars program last winter with Gilda Haas at the UCLA Labor Center, and we kind of were like going along for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we kind of got to a point where we were thinking about how do we make these bridges concrete that we keep talking about around the urgency of this moment and anti-fascism and naming the things that for what they are. And we got into this conversation that was really intense, and it was about, we started out talking about Beloved, the book Beloved by Toni Morrison, and we were talking about a very famous scene in both the book and the film in which former slaves are asked to look at your hands, love your hands, because yonder they hate your hands. That let the children come, let them hear you laugh, let your parents hear you laugh. And what it means for your flesh to be desecrated. What does that mean? Not just in the context of slavery, and especially post-antebellum period and the post-bellum period, but now to have your flesh desecrated constantly, and then be so drilled with your worthlessness that you can't even connect yourself to other movements and other people across the world whose experiences may be so much more similar to yours than the people who live on the next block because of the way that gentrification works, for example. And so for us to have been siphoned off into these kinds of communities of isolation make it very difficult right now for people to answer this kind of question about what is this moment here? How do we diagnose it? And one of the things that came out of this conversation was this reference to actually another work, scholarly work, about recovering the history of Malinche, of Malintzin Tenepal, putting flesh back on the object. We are always so objectified as Black people, as brown people. Our bodies are objectified and commodified and desecrated on a daily basis and consumed, and it's such a bad situation that sometimes we are the primary culprits, Black and brown communities, that in terms of the consumption of Black death and desecration, and brown death and desecration. And so how do you overcome that? How do you connect to the human in that in order to then position yourself, bring your best self, know who you are, as Shana's talking about, come into, whether it's a room or a stage or into conversation with someone, and be able to talk about these questions of revolution and really mean them from your heart, because you know that it's not just a matter of the future of the country, but it's a matter of the future of our children, of our flesh, our very flesh. So it's a roundabout way of saying that these are both very, very important questions for connecting these what appear to be very disparate things, but it also helps us to do what we felt was a central intervention of the book, which Alex started to mention, and that I'll just expand upon here, and that is to uncover, to blast away what Cedric Robinson called the covering conceits of a racial regime, that racial regimes are hostile to their own discovery, so in fact then they mask themselves in so many different kinds of relationships that it makes it very hard for us to see what it is, but also then when we do begin to uncover these connections to communities that appear to have no connection to our own experience and our own situated knowledge, then the regime becomes extremely hostile. And that's when we know we're close. And I think this is the moment here where a lot of people don't know that that's the moment, that we're very close because of the hostility that is presented and enacted in ways that are so violent. It's because we're so close to uncovering those conceits. So I'll start maybe there, and we can.
Just very briefly to get at your question, essay. I think that if one starts with the premise that capitalism is racial, that there is racial capitalism, what that insight does is to reorient world history around questions of colonialism and not merely in the production of capitalism. And so if we center an analysis of colonialism as at the sort of bedrock of racial capitalism, I think that leads to a kind of recognition of a global history that is necessarily opposed to a Eurocentric reading of capitalist historiography or capitalist teleology. And so that's why I think Robinson, as well as people in this book, like Greg Burris is writing about Black Palestinian solidarity. Paul Ortiz is writing about the Mexican Revolution and Black radicalism. Daryl Thomas writes about Malcolm X's excursions throughout North Africa and the Middle East. It's because of the recognition in Cedric's work and in this work, in those scholars' works, that Black radicalism engages questions of racial capitalism and colonialism that not only produce an understanding of how the world has been partitioned and divided, but also new centers of emerging politics or political imaginaries that are global. And I think that's a little bit distinct from the Marxist notion of an internationalist or internationalism, which sometimes, or at least in its worst formations, remains quite Eurocentric.
And we'll give the authors the last word there. We can have a round of applause for our wonderful panel. And so as the chair of the Department of African American Studies, one of my major responsibilities is to remind you that we are for us, by us, and also thank you for supporting our programming. And one thing just to leave you with, and I will ask for you to guess who you think this is, and then I will tell you at the end as our closing set of thoughts. The future is filled with vast and marvelous possibilities. This is a great time to be alive. Let us not despair. Let us realize that as we struggle for justice and freedom, we have cosmic companionship. I want to tell you that that year is 1957, and the author of the quote is Martin Luther King Jr. So when we're thinking about the future as bleak and all of these other things, 1957 was the year that he said that. And he is no longer with us, so let us not despair, and let us all give a round of applause to Gaye and Alex. Feel free to recept out in the atrium and to also pick up a copy of Futures of Black Radicalism.
Thank you, Tom.
You can get it signed by folks here, so it's a double bubble, as we say in Philly.